Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 27. Could still be years. "Jatesy," Mari called as she walked into her daughter's kitchen sometime in snowing season. She'd quit looking at the date weeks ago because the calendar had ceased being concerned with what the weather was doing. "Do you have your list for the storehouse? I'm leaving in just a moment." Jatesy picked up a scrap from the work table where her husband was cutting out a piece of leather. "Right here, Mother. Are you working there every week now?" Mari sighed as she pocketed the list underneath her thick cloak. "Might as well. Since the university has cut back to classes only twice a week because of the weather, I don't have as much to do. And I certainly don't want to get on Lilla's nerves even more. The storehouse is a good diversion." "Mari," Deck said from where he was mending a torn stirrup on a saddle, "please let me take you over there in the sleigh. It's so cold." She shook her head. "Thank you again, but no. The snowshoes work well enough, so I'll see you in 6 hours when you pick me and the goods up." "But Mari," Deck sighed, "I appreciate diversions too." Mari groaned inwardly at her son-in-law's somber face. He had very little to do right now. 23 head of cattle. That was all that was left of the nearly 700 he, Cambo, Lek, and Bubba herded together. When deceit blew, the cattle stampeded into the hills. Most died within days, inhaling too much ash. They were slaughtered where they fell, and their usable meat turned into jerky. Deck ate none of it. He was quiet for weeks after that, mourning his favorite cows, strongest bulls, and most promising calves. Now he and his sons were left with only 23 head, which they took turns caring for most attentively. But it was the fewest number of cattle Deck had since he was forced into becoming a farmer by his parents' early death because of the pox back in Edge. Now he was repairing a saddle that he would later bring to the storehouse. The families were down to 4 horses, Clark 14, Gray Clark 10, and 2 others. They'd lost another horse yesterday, its meat prepared to feed the remaining sheepdogs on the east side of the valley. But while the Briders and Shins had 4 horses, they had 5 saddles. Salem wasn't a place of holding on to anything unneeded. Once the saddle was in good order again, it'd be donated back to the storehouse for someone who may need it. Deck had murmured yesterday, as he watched from a distance the butchers working to salvage the horse meat, that he suspected there'd soon be a surplus of tack and a lack of horses. The saddle and tackle makers would need to find new work until the balance shifted again, just like Deck had to. Mari's heart nearly broke to see her favorite son-in-law with so little to do. She walked over to him and kissed his forehead. "Oh, dear Deck, I understand. That's why I'm having you pick me up. But the walking there does me good." "Well, if you change your mind," he began, then noticed his wife doing something. Mari turned to Jatesy. She moved suddenly as if trying to stop whatever it was she'd been doing. "Deck's got plenty of things to repair," Jatesy said, a practiced tone to her voice. "But I know of someone else who'd be willing to give you a ride." "Who?" Mari asked suspiciously. "Well," Jatesy said, "just yesterday I ran into Sarah, Henry's granddaughter, and she told me—" Her mother held up her hand. "No, Jates." "Mother, just consider," Jatesy pleaded. "I already said—" "Mother, you're fading again." Deck rolled his eyes. Apparently that wasn't the way they rehearsed this. "I'm what?" Mari asked. Her daughter sighed. "What I mean is, back in Weeding after Deceit awoke, you began to seem... you were more..." "Normal," her husband suggested. "Better," Jatesy glared at him. She turned back to her mother with softer eyes. "You were laughing, joking with the children, but lately you've become quieter again." Her voice became softer as well. "I miss you. Everyone misses you. I thought maybe you might be ready to..." She looked over at her husband for help. Deck opened his mouth but wasn't sure what to add. "Jates, Deck," Mari said gently, "I understand what you're trying to say. I was foolish to be cheerful after the eruption. I was so sure the last day was just around the corner, and that, ridiculously, made me happy." Jatesy squeezed her mother's arm. "I know you thought that. But how long until the last day? None of us knows. The famine that will strike the world may last a long time. They might limp along for several years. The famine may even reach us. The writings never specified a time frame." "Unfortunately," Deck muttered and went back to working on the repair. "Could still be years." "It's just that," Jatesy hesitated again, "considering that it may still be many more years, maybe you don't want to be alone for all that time. Henri is still—" Mari closed her eyes. "Oh, Jatesy, it's not that simple." Jatesy cleared her throat expectantly. Mari opened her eyes and saw her daughter giving her husband a deliberate look. Deck's mouth formed a small O, and he set down the leather. Apparently it was time for him to say his part. "Mari, I won't pretend to know the mind of Perrin, but if something were to happen to me, I wouldn't want Jatesy to fade away. I wouldn't have a problem if she spent her remaining life with someone like one of Shem's nephews. The Creator doesn't want us to be alone or lonely." He glanced at his wife to see if he'd said it right. She smiled at him in approval, then turned to her mother. "Just think about it. You probably thought Father was on his way back home to us, didn't you? That in just a season or two you'd be back together again?" Mari clenched her teeth to keep her chin from trembling. That was exactly what she thought. But now it was the middle of an endless snowing season. So long that it felt like they were experiencing the third manifestation of it. And there was no hope, no end, no last day in sight. There was nothing. She turned to her son-in-law. "Deck, I will meet you and the sleigh in 6 hours." She walked out of the door without another word. Outside of the Brighter house, she strapped on one of the several pairs of snowshoes waiting on the porch. Making enough for all of Salem had given the cobblers a couple weeks' worth of work. Wrapped the cloak around her tighter, and set off for the storehouse, feeling taller than she'd ever had. Then again, when the snow's nearly 4 feet deep, deeper than it's ever been, everyone's taller. But that didn't elevate her spirits at all. The sky was gray. The dingy ash-tinted snow was a lighter gray, and every tree, bush, and uncovered rock was also white-gray. She always thought gray was the ugliest color. Maybe it isn't even really a color, Mari thought, as she walked toward the center of Salem. Sure, she'd heard the debates that white was the absence of all color, no, black was the absence of all color, but to Mari, gray was the death of all color. She thought of the different grays that she knew. Peto's gray eyes, which was the only shade of gray she truly loved, tinged light blue like her father's. Her smoky gray silk dress in Idemia. It was beautiful in the candlelight, but nowhere else. The gray of the stone in her house in Edge, which had tans and whites mottled through to give the gray variety. The weathered gray of the wood of her home, which was even larger and warmer than her dreams remembered. Her gray hair. And that was the end of her "things that are gray that I don't completely hate" list. Except for her hair. Every week she vainly inspected it, looking for remnants of light brown. They must have been hiding on the back of her head where she couldn't see them, for all she ever found was gray. Surrounding her head, surrounding her whole being, it was the ugliest snowing season she'd ever endured. It was bleak, dead, bland, dead, boring, and dead. Nothing had been different for many, many weeks now. If the last day was coming, surely there would have been something else interesting happening. But no, there was snow and now frequent fog, which was also gray. All of Salem felt the heaviness and was trying to fight it. She could see it in their eyes when they came to the storehouse, where she spent a moment talking after the congregational meetings. The grayness was eating at everyone. Usually Salem was alive every night in the snowing season. People gathering at the rectories for dances, storytelling, tasting new recipes, enjoying performances and arts. But traveling to the evening activities was hampered because of the incredible snow depths. Many of the rectors considered reducing the events, but Guide Zenas asked them to keep them going. If only a handful of people could come, then at least a handful of people felt joy for a few hours. Mari walked past their neighbors, the snow halfway up to their windows, and smiled dimly at the pale green of the house. She glanced to her right to see the 3 brightly painted yellow homes of the Zenases, sitting in the gray like defiant daffodils. Many of the houses and even barns in Salem were now vibrantly hued in rebellion against the ash. It began when the first block houses were constructed back in harvest, just before the weather turned bitterly cold. To hide the fact that ash created the block, the new houses were painted in bright colors: red, yellow, green, blue. The bleak block suddenly was beautiful. Shem saw the painted block houses, and he recommended to the paint makers that they create massive amounts of pigment. Everyone would be wanting to paint their houses, no matter what they were made out of. The gray and dying landscape needed something to brighten it. That harvest season, when they were usually bringing in the crops, preparing storage, and sending families to restock the emergency shelters along the routes to the ancient temple site, Salem instead painted with gusto. Usually harvest was one of the most beautiful times of the year, with trees throughout the valley and the mountainsides turning into vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows. But long ago the leaves had turned predictably gray before crumbling. So instead the houses became red, orange, and yellow. A few became purple, some even pink, and many became green, since nothing else was. Other houses became the same blue the sky used to be, and one woman went so far as to paint her family's barn blue with a variety of fluffy clouds floating across it, just to remember what the sky was supposed to look like. She started a trend, the first ever in Salem. Soon every barn was blue, and she was asked to paint clouds all over Salem. She taught others her methods, and additional artists took to painting life-size pine trees under the clouds. By the time the temperatures became too cold to keep the paint fluid, every neighborhood in Salem had at least one barn to remind them how their valley used to look. Mari frequently looked from her bedroom window to see the blue, white, and green of the estate's shared barn. Before the deep snows came, she could see the splotchy flowers her grand and great-grandchildren painted along the bottom. The last tall red tulip young Shem had created by stretching as high as he could was covered by a layer of drifting snow last week. But once the snows decided to melt, there'd be planting season flowers again, ones that would never fade. Dec and Jatesy and their children had painted their house a deep red. Ralph's house looked like a pumpkin now. Cambo and his family lived in a dark green bushy house, while Bubba and Barnos both had army blue houses. But Pato was still holding out on painting his corner of the States. While he appreciated the cheery variety of yellows of the Zenas homes down the lane, he wanted something a little different for his house. He wanted it to look like the peaches he didn't get to harvest that year. He'd seen a few attempts at peach on other houses, but too often they turned out pink. That color may have been fine for Mrs. Jordan and the 2 widows she lived with, but Rector Shin's house and the former house of the General of Salem just should not be pink. Mari heartily agreed. She didn't mind his holding off until someone created the perfect peach paint when the weather warmed again. While she hated gray, the gray of her wooden home was still acceptable. It was the color in her dreams, after all. She trekked along the hard-packed snow, following the paths of many before her, until she came to the storehouse. She went into the side entrance, hung up her wraps, and nodded a greeting to others arriving. She put on the long apron with several deep pockets, perfect for carrying smaller items Salemites needed help finding, and went to the front counter in the welcome room to see who she could help next. Because of the sheer size of the storehouse, it was often difficult for people to remember where everything was. Volunteers like Mari helped people gather supplies, especially for young mothers already wrestling with an infant or toddler. There was a short line of Salemites waiting in the welcome room for the next assistant, and Mari produced her cheeriest face, which, considering her mood, was likely rather dreary. "What can I get for you?" she asked a woman in her mid-30s. "Professor Shin!" the woman exclaimed. What are you doing here?" She got that a lot. People surprised to see her out and working, as if she had anything else better to do. Maybe they thought she should be sitting on a shelf, looking properly widowish. Mari usually skipped past their surprise with something like, "I see you have a list. May I help you with that?" 15 minutes later, she and the woman returned to the checkout counter in the welcome room with several baskets of goods, the items to be recorded in the receipts book, and Mari turned to see the next person in line and bristled. The woman facing her this time had a much different attitude. "Well, if it isn't Mari Shin," Eltana Jordan sneered. "I wondered where you've been holed up. Figured you'd be hiding away like everyone else." Mari clenched her fist, a very un-Salem-like thing to do. "Eltana?" she said coldly. Mari had seen Mrs. Jordan only sporadically since young pair ran away. She never went to the congregational meetings, not seeing the point of them, and certainly didn't bother to visit the Shins. But she'd taken over the armchair general's gatherings quite handily, holding meetings every moon at her home to discuss strategies and to speculate on the current status of the army. Calla went once to see what General Jordan's widow was up to, and discovered that the tone of the meetings had turned to how easily the world could be taken over. After the eruption of deceit, reports had come back to Shem that Mrs. Jordan was pulling out maps to demonstrate to the former army members, and now dozens of interested Salemites, just how vulnerable the world was. Mari wondered briefly if the first battle was about to commence right there. "How may I help you?" She struggled to get those words out. Mrs. Jordan scoffed. A Shin helping me? Isn't there someone else available?" She looked around haughtily. "It's been my experience that Shins aren't very good at completing a task, despite their inherent talent." The 24 people in the room turned to Mrs. Jordan with expressions of shock. Mari clamped her jaw tight. No doubt she was alluding to young Pear, and his obvious inability to do whatever she had sent him into the world to do. "No one here will help you to do what's not in the Creator's will, Eltana," Mari said steadily. She rolled her eyes. "Oh, enough with the Creator nonsense. I swear you all hide behind that to shield yourselves from doing anything interesting or brave." Mari clenched her other fist. "Bravery is not blindly running into—" She stopped herself, trying to remember what she was there for. "Mrs. Jordan, I'm here to assist you. Now, what may I retrieve?" "I'm serious," Mrs. Jordan said, her eyes as hard as iron. "I don't want anything more to do with Shins. Your family's nothing but one disappointment after—" Mercifully, she didn't get to finish her sentence, because Salemites were being very un-Salem-like and shouting, "How dare you! Do you have any idea what they've done for us? This is the general's widow, one of the most revered women in Salem." Mari knew she was turning red, not from fury, but from embarrassment. Most revered woman? For forcing nearly everyone through her history of the world class when they entered the university? And then what did she do? It was her husband they revered, who they still loved. They respected her simply because she was the closest thing attached to him. It's not as if Mari had ever wielded a sword or prepared a way for the Salemites to escape, and she certainly wasn't about to do anything braver than try to stare down Eltana Jordan either. She did nothing other than help them find spoons and bootlaces. And then there was that label, widow. Men were widowers, and for some reason that made the men seem stronger, abler, like Henri. The label widow, however, added 15 years to whatever woman wore it, and a dozen more wrinkles. Please, please! Assistant Anno came into the area from a back records room, his wide girth barely clearing the doorframe. He held up his hands and called for quiet. What's going on here? This isn't our way to shout and argue. What's the problem? Eltana and Mari stood in the middle of it all, glowering at each other with so much heat, the snow around the storehouse should have melted instantly. Nothing's wrong, Mari said in a harsh whisper, not shifting her gaze. No, Eltana said with a nasty smile. Just a little matter. She looked Mari up and down with disdain. The widow Shin felt she'd just been given a stooped back. And why was it, Mari's thoughts wandered enviously, did the term widow sit on Eltana like a whip on a war horse? Nothing a couple of women of the world can't handle. Go back to your little office, Mrs. Jordan said with a dismissive wave. Off with you now, you little man. Assistant Anno puffed up his ample chest, innocent of Mrs. Jordan's sarcasm. Now, whenever we have a conflict in Salem, we bring it to... Mrs. Jordan's sharp glare shifted to stop the poor man in mid-sentence. Go home to your little wife, she snapped. The two of us can handle this. Anno, taken aback, stammered. My wife passed away a few years ago. If that was supposed to soften Mrs. Jordan, it didn't work. She chortled mirthlessly as she said, Well, I don't blame her. I'd die to get away from such a pathetic man like you. Eltana, Mari cried. Enough! She didn't dare glance at poor Anno to see the devastation on his face. The rest of the Salemites took an instinctive step back from the two women now eyeing each other like hungry coyotes. It is enough, Eltana shouted back. How long are you people going to pretend there's nothing wrong in the world? They're facing certain disaster, and now's the perfect time to form an army and march down there. It's open and desperate and ready to be conquered. Lemuel's leading it all, which means he'll be at the head of the army. He's an easy target now. Yet you all sit here doing nothing for those poor miserable people suffering under his rule. Still, Eltana, Mari said, trying to keep her own voice calm. After all this time, you still want revenge? It won't change anything. It won't bring back Gary or make you feel better. Living here hasn't made me feel any better either, Eltana interrupted. Perrin could have done it, but he was too cowardly. Shem could do it, but he's lost his fight. And your grandson. You stop right there, Eltana, Mari growled. The Salemites took another step back. But Mrs. Jordan wasn't in the mood to stop. He's as useless and timid as the rest of this valley. Peaceful, gentle people are as worthless as a flock of lambs against a wolf. But they could be so much more. They could... Eltana, shut up! Mari roared so loudly that Mrs. Jordan blinked in surprise. Several of the Salemites were now with their backs up against the walls. Assistant Anno remained stunned and motionless. Any quarrel you may have, you have with me only, Mari hissed. You leave these people out of it. It's my husband you're bitter against, my grandson you deceived with delusions of grandeur, my brother who you have no faith in. It's bad enough you don't even try to understand what we're accomplishing here. that you take advantage of our generosity. And now you dare insult the people who have done nothing but welcome you to their homes from the day you arrived? You ungrateful, selfish cow. Now, I'm going to ask this one more time." She balled up both fists again. "What can I do to help you, Mrs. Jordan?" "You know," said an unexpected voice from the door, "I think I can take care of this." Judith, Shem's oldest sister, strode in with a calculated smile, her white-gray hair swept up into a tight and disciplined bun. Being the oldest of 7 children, then matriarch over a large posterity, had taught her how to say something sweetly, yet with an undercurrent that suggested one best not disagree with her. "Mrs. Jordan, if you will follow me into the storehouse, I'll be happy to help you find whatever you need." With a gaze so sharp it could have severed a limb, Mrs. Jordan sent one last wounding glance at Mari, then turned to Judith, clearly unaware that she was the oldest sister of one of her greatest enemies. "I'm sure you can help me. I have a list." Mari remained stiff and unyielding in the welcome room, which hadn't been feeling very welcoming until Mrs. Jordan followed Judith into the storehouse. Only once she was out of sight did Mari finally exhale. So did everyone else in the room. "Oh, she's something else, isn't she?" One woman in her 40s voiced everyone's thoughts. "My goodness! I've heard about the hardness of women from the world, but I had no idea. Mrs. Shin, you're nothing like her." Mari chuckled sadly. "But that's my problem, Mrs. Imago. I fear that in many ways I am." "Well," Mrs. Imago said firmly, "you suppress it quite successfully then. You're truly a Salemite. For a moment there I thought you might just strike her, but you held back." Mari smiled wanly as the Salemites patted her shoulder and assured her of their support. She turned to Assistant Anno, who still looked pale. "I'm so sorry about her, Assistant," she said quietly. "She's had a traumatic life and seems to think the only way to make herself feel better is to make everyone feel worse. That makes no sense, I know, but—" "It's all right," the assistant assured her, but still he wiped a bead of nervous sweat from off his forehead. He took Mari by the arm and led her over to a quiet corner. "I didn't handle that very well, did I? She caught me completely off guard. And that was only up against one person from the world. How can I possibly—" Mari cut him off. "That's because she's the meanest." She hesitated to say it, but realized she'd already called Eltana the term in front of everyone. "Cow to ever exist in the world." Anna was shocked, but he nodded his agreement. "Your lessons are coming along quite well," Mari assured him. "It's difficult to face someone with no respect for others or themselves. There's a hardness and darkness in their souls that you need to learn not to empathize with. I realize that goes against everything you've ever done, but if you were to learn to communicate with the people of the world and lie to them," she whispered the last words, "you cannot allow yourself to be sucked into their pain and anger. You need to deflect it, like you would shoo away a mosquito, and continue on your course. Let them rail and rant. It should not and will not affect you." Anno's face fell. "I didn't do any of that, Mrs. Shin. She struck me a personal blow, and suddenly I froze." "Well, this was a good experience then," Mari said brightly. "Now we know what your weakness is, so we can practice making it a strength in our lying sessions." Anno sighed, dubious. "I promise you, Assistant," Mari said in a low tone, "should you ever face the world as you volunteered to, they will poke at every tender point. Let them. Ignore them. They can't hurt you permanently. Even death is only temporary. You stay on your course, and they'll find themselves believing every word you tell them." "I trust you, Mrs. Shin," Anno said, not lying very well. I really do. I just don't trust myself. That's what Shem and I are training you to do, Anno, Mari said. No one has a more innocent face than you, believe that. I'm trying to, Mrs. Shin. I just hope that if and when the time comes, I'll be ready. Mari sighed. It could be years, assistant, she whispered sadly, as she looked out a window to the gray world that seemed to get darker. Still years. We have plenty of time to get you ready. The lieutenant looked out his windows and decided gray was the ugliest color ever. Maybe it wasn't even a color. Somehow it seemed like the death of colors. Maybe that was because after the mass deaths, the sun didn't shine again. The bleakness of that snowy day remained, as if cursing the land that allowed so many to die. And then it snowed, and snowed, and snowed. Occasionally the lieutenant glanced up the canyon, trying to see if the sky was clearing to the north, but all he saw was the gray-white sameness that dominated the countryside around Edge. That morning, the something day of raining, snowing season, he was sure he'd get everyone to call it, and it really didn't matter the date since every single day was exactly the same. He had the usual breakfast of cooked wheat, which had the gall to be gray as well, tinged a little with brown. He swallowed it down quickly, as tasteless as the deep snow outside, and made his way over to the study. Slither wouldn't be up until almost midday meal, but the lieutenant had his work laid out for him. He picked up a copy of the writings revised version and sneered. Everyone had a new copy, delivered weeks ago to every house with the directive that everyone should read it as soon as possible. Few likely did, even with the promise from the guide and general that the words would help each family get through the bleak season, which seemed would never end. Holy Day meetings were also mandatory, with citizens required to sign a ledger as they arrived in order to get their rations for the next week. The rectors then tried to guide Edgers in understanding the new order in the world. The lieutenant struggled to keep his face passive at the meetings, which were nothing like he remembered congregational meetings. Just like the Finn book before him, while the title was familiar, nothing else in it was. That's because he tweaked it. The lieutenant smirked and looked around the study. Sure that he was alone, he whispered, "Define tweaked." Good morning to you, too. Tweaked. Alter, change, manipulate. Slither would call it fine-tuning, but that's an understatement. He thumbed through the pages. The little I've seen of this seems to read differently than I remember. Of course, the language has been brought up to date, or so they say. They thought the way we spoke 360 years ago was so different that no one could understand it now. Has our language really changed that much? No, but it was an excuse to revise the writings. Wait, I believe the word they used was clarify. It seems a lot smaller, too, even by Idamean standards. Who needs all the explanations and names and dates anyway? All people need are snippets of ideas to make them feel good for a moment. But like eating, a mere snippet isn't sustaining for more than a few hours. The lieutenant turned a couple of pages. Hey, they took out the section about the first horse riders. I always liked that part. You would. Anything risky, you'd like it. Looks like they took out everything about the first families. It only says, thus the first pairings began in the world. Pairings? What happened to families? Pairings is far more accommodating. Couples and families imply commitment. Pairings sounds more like a partner you found for playing a game. In a few hours or days, you're free to find another pairing. The lieutenant let out a low whistle. Oof, just how much updating did they do? As much as they needed to create the world after their own image. Lemuel has his own vision, and Slither and Wayne support it because they want whatever crumbs fall from his table. Lemuel's on his way to making his perfect world. For him, but no one else. Now, why should he care about anyone else? No one has before, he mumbled. So why take out the interesting parts? No one cares about reading anymore. If the chapters were longer than a page, no one would get through it. Spend time thinking, pondering, understanding? Well, no one's been doing that in years. They just want to hurry through the assignment so they can go be entertained. I think schooling taught them that. Likely, the lieutenant scoffed quietly. Were you at the last Holy Day meeting? Wherever you go, I go. Ignoring that assurance, he said, That was something different, wasn't it? The rector spent less than 2 minutes explaining the idea of patience, read 2 short passages, then spent the rest of the half hour singing those melodies from some ridiculous play. Even Mama would have lost patience with that. His voice caught in the last sentence. From what I understand, he's supposed to teach for half an hour each holy day. I don't think Guide Lannert specified what he was supposed to teach, as long as something comes from the writings. Well, the people loved it, have to admit that, the lieutenant said. It was the first time in weeks I saw anyone smiling. They were singing along, shouting out requests. I don't think they'll have to make attendance mandatory anymore. He's becoming quite popular, especially after he invited that girl up and pulled a slip of silver from behind her ear. They may have to move him to the amphitheater when everyone decides to go to his services. That's where he's used to performing anyway. The singing rector. Maybe Pato should try that. The lieutenant smiled. Except he'd be too preoccupied with trying to teach something useful. After a moment, he asked, Pugga, how are they? On the other side of the mountain? Go find out for yourself, young pair. The lieutenant closed his eyes. You know, I can't do that. Not only because the snow is ridiculously deep, especially up the mountain, but teach these people how to make snowshoes like they have in Salem. The lieutenant blinked. I forgot about those. They'd be really helpful here. Sometimes, he began, and felt the need to utter the words out loud. Sometimes I feel like I've forgotten a lot of important things, he murmured. But shaking that off before the voice in his head could comment, he said, Just tell me, Pugga, since I don't have snowshoes, how's Mama? I don't know. Remember, wherever you go, I go. Come on, you've got connections, don't you? Send someone to find out. If you're so worried about her, send yourself to find out. I can't yet. I have to fix things first, Colonel. I have to go back as a success somehow. Otherwise, all of this will seem like a waste of time. The cosmos sighed. They won't care in what condition you return. Just return. They don't care about what you consider success. To them, success is a child in every chair at the dinner table. Yours is still empty, waiting. The lieutenant rubbed his forehead. I can't go back empty-handed, Colonel. I have to bring... It's not a wedding, young pair. Just bring yourself. And you could fashion snowshoes in a day. Maybe in time, Colonel, the lieutenant whispered. Just give me a little more time, just to see what I can do. Lieutenant, I don't know how much time you have. Things aren't going as Lemuel was hoping. He has plans for you, and they're starting to change. What do you mean? What was the general hoping? Lemuel expected the world would be growing more disaffected with the guide. He thought by now that the world would be ready to destroy the guide and demand a new one. He frowned. But that's not happening. At least not around here. People are depressed, but they're just accepting that. Exactly. Instead of rising up in anger, everyone is falling into despair. The weather has a great deal to do with that, but so does the rationing of food and the realization that so many friends and family who died really are gone. It's finally sinking in, and everyone is sinking with it. Lemuel didn't anticipate this, because he's never lost anyone he cared about. When you don't care about anyone, you don't understand the weight of grief. Now he doesn't know how to proceed. Interesting. Exactly how was I to fit into his plans? People should have been calling for Guy Lanner's execution by now. And if they were, well, how does the name Guy Leck strike you? The lieutenant flinched. Good, that's what I was hoping. You can't be serious, he whispered, something heavy building in his belly. Me? Turned into the guide? Can you think of a better scenario for Lemuel? He'd control your every word. And since you're his son, how could you not be perfect and obey him? You've made quite a good impression on the citizens of Edge, and Lemuel's heard about it. When planting season arrives, people will be hoping for someone to bring them hope. You still may be Lemuel's first pick. How fortunate! The Creator choosing General Thorne's son to be the next guide. But first he has to find a way to eliminate Lannard. The lieutenant sank in his chair, dismayed. Lannard thinks Thorne is his friend. How can he just dispose of people like that? That's a question you should seriously be considering, because you could easily be next, Lieutenant. He doesn't know grief because he doesn't know love. He certainly doesn't love you. He doesn't even like you. You remind him too much of me. But he desperately wants to use you, just like you're using him. But if you go too far, he'll dispose of you and find someone else to become his son. Maybe Lieutenant Kaya. He has a greater claim than you do anyway. The lieutenant blinked. What, Kaya? I've run into him a couple of times, but he's nothing special. Just a regular young officer like me. Are you entirely sure about that? The lieutenant rolled his eyes in aggravation. Now what? Does it ever end around here? Now I need to be worried about Kaya? How does he have a greater claim? What do you know, old man? Silence. Well? Nothing. Colonel! The Cosmos didn't reply. General! Still quiet. The lieutenant sighed. Pugga? Yes, young pair. What do you know? I know it's time for you to give up playing their games, that there'll always be another to take your place. Tell me about Kaya, please, Pugga. Tell me what to do, who to avoid. Why? Will you go home? Eventually. Not good enough, Lieutenant. Will you go home? He sighed. Colonel! Funny how often I change rank with you depending upon your mood. Colonel, General, Pugga, old man? Pugga, the lieutenant whispered. Please just help me. I will not help you against the Creator's will, young pair. I've told you that before. So I'm on my own? Do you even know what you're planning? Not entirely. I'm still working on it. I'm just kind of waiting for inspiration, I guess. The question is then, young pair, when that inspiration finally comes, who is it that's inspiring you? The lieutenant sighed, picked up their writings, and began to read his assignment for the day, the first 3 pages of their writings. We are all citizens. We have always been citizens. We have always been progressing. We have a duty to the Creator, to the guide, and to the general as we progress. The lieutenant rolled his eyes and heard a disgusted sigh next to him. Ugh, wake me when it's over. Lemuel Thorne marched the roads of Idumea, his guard of 10 surrounding but several paces away, so that Lemuel could look into the faces of the people who passed their perimeter. No one looked back. No one ever met the penetrating gaze of General Lemuel Thorne. but neither did anyone dare cross the road to the other side, just in case they were questioned later about their deliberate avoidance. Lemuel tried to gauge their demeanors, their anxiety. Their levels of stress were crucial to his next step. But everyone kept their heads down, trying to keep from slipping on the patches of snow and thick ice that covered every road and path in Idumea. No one had ever known such a cold season as this. Thorn didn't quit trying, though, and occasionally he caught the eye of someone shuffling past. It was always the same thing: fear. Nothing else? At all? He wished he could walk among the people in disguise to discover what they thought. But there was no way he could hide his perfect physique, his chiseled face, or his blonde hair with distinguished gray highlights. He simply was too unforgettable a man to be disguised as something more common. Yesterday he strolled with Guide Lannard through Idumea, watching how people reacted to him. But it was the same. Eyes cast down, their steps quickening to pass them. Lannard didn't notice, as he marched proudly through the shopping district, his chest puffed up, occasionally checking his profile in the glass of the few shops that weren't boarded over. Over the past season, Lannard had grown into the part. He eagerly donned his red silk cape to spend half an hour greeting those who came to see him during his public time. Trembling in his presence, citizens usually just asked for a blessing. Guide Lannard would take a deep breath, raise his hands to the ceiling, then after great arm-waving, place his hands on the shoulders of the person kneeling before him. He'd mumble incomprehensibly for a few moments, then remove his hands and nod. Blessing granted. Thorn asked him once what he said in those mumbles, and Lannard merely shrugged. "It's too marvelous for even me to understand," he said with his sloppy grin. Thorn was confused, which was rare for him. Not just because the simple people willingly accepted that Guide Lannard's nonsensical blessings were granted, but because no one was protesting, or beating on the mansion gates, or throwing rocks at the garrison, or, more frustratingly, attempting to take Lannard's life. They were acting as pitifully as his mother's old dog, who always cowered, especially when his father came home each evening. Maybe it was because Cain kicked the dog every day, so it crowded under the small kitchen table for years. Why that dog never attacked Cain always was a mystery to Lemuel. It was a large animal with sharp teeth, but it never had the will to fight back, just like the people of the world. It wasn't only in Idumea that the citizens hid in a corner. The phenomenon was happening everywhere. Each week Lemuel received updates from every fort, and the news was mystifyingly similar. Villages were quiet, rationing was going smoothly, citizens rarely ventured out of their houses except to attend the mandatory weekly congregational meetings, soldiers were obedient. Not that Lemuel didn't want obedience. In a way, everyone was behaving as he wanted them to, but they were doing so prematurely. They were supposed to blindly obey Guide Leck after demanding the life of Guide Lannard for causing so many people to die. But apparently the world just wasn't angered enough by the event. They seemed to actually see the reasoning behind his decision, the Creator's decision. Whatever the Creator wanted, whatever the guide told them, and whatever the general enforced was just fine by them. They were so complacent. Dully, boringly complacent. Lemuel had to rethink the situation. His son should still become the next guide, that was clear, but he'd have to find a way to eliminate Lannard, perhaps through something quick and innocent, like an accident or bad mead. But not until his son was ready to come to Idumea. It'd be convenient if the lieutenant completed his education first. Once he was the guide and handing out blessings to the masses of beautiful girls who'd be lining up for him to lay hands upon, he wouldn't have any time, especially considering the additional duties Lemuel was considering. The population would need rebuilding, and Lemuel wanted his bloodline to dominate the new generation. He dismissed the reasoning of Cain that the blood of the Thorns be rare. His father had argued that more than one child would make each child less special. It'd be like watering down the mead until its potency was lost. But Lemuel had seen it differently. He'd be making an extra large batch of mead, full strength, and there'd be more to go around. Sheep didn't become less sheepish if a ram had several offspring. His strengths would become even more dominant. And that's what needed to happen in the world. There was no better way than for Lek to become the main breeding ram for his new flock. Certainly no females that Lemuel selected for his son would reject the opportunity to serve as a mate for the guide. Lemuel could even allow him to father a few girls here and there, just to keep balance in the population. It was the numbers he needed to work out. A capable ram could easily handle a dozen ewes or more, 12 offspring a year, then 12 different ewes the next year to produce another dozen children, then alternate the ewes each year so the ram could serve as 24 different ewes. But would that be enough? Lemuel wondered as he strode briskly down another road, lost in thought. 12 children a year, keep up that rate for 10 years, then cycle out those worn-out ewes for another set of younger ones. Lek could be productive until he was well into his 50s, just like Lemuel. And Lemuel could certainly help with repopulation efforts for a few more years, with half a dozen ewes, but only ones who produced males. Lemuel calculated. In 25 years, when he was in his late 70s, he could preside over 350 descendants. Provided, that is, if Lek was as capable in that regard as his father. And because of his past reticence to prove that he was, Lemuel could only assume that he was as vigorous as all Thorn men were. At least half of those descendants should be males, ready to lead the world with the Thorn name. Lemuel didn't realize he'd marched past the road that led to his mansion, too lost in adding up how many grandsons, and maybe even more sons he should have, until he glanced up to see he was on his way to the garrison. None of his guards said anything, prudently, as the general abruptly turned around and headed back to the correct road. He needed to see his son again. It'd been a full season since he'd last spoke with him. They sent messages back and forth with predictable pleasantries and reports of his progress, but he hadn't had the opportunity to look him in the eyes. Everything that reached Lemuel about his son was quite complimentary, so likely quite suspicious. Who willingly acted as a perfect son without any other motive? Lemuel had also presented himself as the perfect young man, plotting to become the youngest High General ever, becoming his son-in-law, then exposing his own father's secret behavior to eliminate his bid as High General, had been the flawless plan. Until that woman destroyed it all. She turned Jates's heart away from him, tore Perrin's heart from his chest, then gave her own heart to Zenas. Lemuel's pace quickened as he strode back to the mansion, his guards scanning the area for threats that weren't materializing. Surely, he thought, with such a scheming ancestry, Lek also had to have some kind of plan up his sleeve, a silver chip all his own. Lek had too much time on his hands. That was the real problem. He needed to be tempted and diverted by a plan that was mutually advantageous to both of them. For a moment, Lemuel wondered if he was considering the right temptation, but shook it off. Surely every young man wanted power, attention, and the willingness of dozens of young women. What could be more appealing than that? And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.